At 8:15 in the morning on February 17, 1944, an American torpedo bomber flew so close to a Japanese ammunition ship anchored inside Truk Lagoon that when the torpedo struck her side, the resulting explosion killed the pilot, killed both of his crewmen, and killed more than 1,000 Japanese sailors and soldiers in the space of a single breath. There was no wreckage of the aircraft, there was no wreckage of the ship, there was a crater on the surface of the sea, and debris raining down for half a mile in every direction. The pilot was Lieutenant James E. Bridges of Torpedo Squadron 6. He was 26 years old. He had taken off from the USS Intrepid an hour earlier. Inside 48 hours, the American Navy would fly 12,000 tons of bombs and torpedoes into the same lagoon. They would sink 40 Japanese ships. They would destroy 250 aircraft. They would kill 4,500 men. And when it was over, the Japanese sailors on the ground would swear in reports written the same night that the sky had turned black with 900 American planes. There weren't 900, there were about 500. But they kept coming every 4 minutes for 2 days. And one night, until the men on Truk stopped counting. For 26 months, 10 days, and 11 hours, the men of the Pacific Fleet had been waiting for that morning. This is the story of how it came. This is the story of the admiral in Pearl Harbor who ordered it, of the 22-year-old radio men from a small town on the west coast who flew into it, and of the 53-year-old Japanese admiral standing on a ridge above Dublon Island who had known since 1930 that this morning was coming and who could not say a word. The night was black, not dark, not dim. Black, the kind of black the Pacific Ocean can produce when there is no moon, no running lights, and no man-made thing between the water and the sky for 1,000 miles in any direction. It was 11:47 p.m. on the night of February 16, 1944. 90 warships were moving through that blackness. 9 of them were aircraft carriers, 6 were battleships, 10 were cruisers, 28 were destroyers. They were arranged in 3 separate task groups, running within visual distance of each other, all pointed at the same coordinates in the ocean, all silent except for the low, steady rumble of engines turning over at 20 knots. This was Task Force 58. It was the largest concentration of American naval power ever assembled in one place in the history of the world up to that moment, and it was 90 miles from a lagoon that Tokyo had spent 15 years telling the world could not be attacked. The lagoon was called Truk. The men on Task Force 58 called it something else. They called it the trip you did not come back from. On the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, an aviation radioman named Dave Colley was walking past a row of SBD Dauntless dive bombers in the darkness. He was 22 years old. He was from a small town on the west coast. His mother did not know where he was. He had not been allowed to tell her somewhere back home. She was probably making dinner and worrying about a boy she had not heard from in almost a month. Dave Colley did not know it yet, but in 6 hours, he was going to fly into the most heavily defended anchorage in the Pacific Ocean. He was going to fire the twin 30-caliber machine guns bolted behind his cockpit at 3 separate Japanese aircraft. He was going to watch a Japanese ammunition ship explode with such violence that it killed the pilot who dropped the torpedo, and he was going to come home again with his uniform soaked in sweat and his ears ringing and his hands shaking too hard to hold a coffee cup. But that was 6 hours away. Right now, in the black, he was climbing into the back seat of an airplane. 2 decks below him, in the ready room of Bombing Squadron 10, a lieutenant named James Ramage was standing in front of a chalkboard. Ramage was 27 years old, career naval aviator, quiet, careful, the kind of officer his pilots followed without asking why. On the chalkboard behind him was a map of Truk Lagoon. Someone had drawn small circles around every known Japanese warship in the anchorage. Ramage tapped the largest circle with a piece of chalk and Musashi, he said. 72,000 tons at full load, 18-inch guns. If she's still there, we take her first. He paused. If she's not there, we take everything that floats. Nobody spoke, because every man in that room knew what Musashi was. Musashi was the largest battleship in the world. She was the flagship of the entire Imperial Japanese combined fleet. Sinking her would end careers, start careers, rewrite the war. Every pilot on the USS Enterprise had trained for 6 months for the chance to put a bomb into her superstructure. They did not know yet that Musashi was already gone. They would find out in the morning at 600 feet above Truk Lagoon in the middle of a fight for their lives. Because the story of what happened at Truk did not begin on the Enterprise. It began 3,000 miles to the east. It began at Pearl Harbor in a quiet office overlooking a harbor that had been on fire 26 months earlier. A man was sitting at a desk in that office. His name was Chester Nimitz. He was 58 years old. He wore 4 stars on each shoulder. He was the commander-in-chief of the entire Pacific Fleet. He had formally assumed that command on the last day of 1941 aboard the submarine USS Grayling in the wreckage of Pearl Harbor, 3 weeks after the Japanese Navy had come out of the northern Pacific and put the American battle line on the bottom of the harbor. He was a quiet man. He did not give speeches. He did not wear medals. He drank whiskey with his subordinates and played horseshoes with them on the lawn behind his headquarters. He commanded the largest naval force in human history with a soft voice and a Texas accent that most people had to lean in to hear. And in the first week of February 1944, in that office, Chester Nimitz made a decision that was going to change the war. He was going to send Task Force 58 to Truk. For 2 years, Truk had been a name Americans whispered with something close to dread. Intelligence reports called it impregnable. Newspaper editors called it the Japanese Pearl Harbor. Pilots who had flown near its outer reefs described walls of anti-aircraft fire so thick you could walk on them. Nimitz did not believe any of it. He believed in the fleet he now had, because in the 26 months since Pearl Harbor, something had happened in the shipyards of the United States that no one in Tokyo had understood. American industry had gone to war, not as a slogan, not as a metaphor, as a literal, physical transformation of an entire continent into a machine for producing warships. In the single year of 1943, American yards had launched more fleet aircraft carriers than the Imperial Japanese Navy had possessed at the start of the entire conflict. Not repaired, not refitted, brand new Essex-class carriers, 27,000 tons each, almost 100 aircraft on each deck, each one faster and better armed than anything Japan could match. By the first week of February 1944, Nimitz had 9 of them within striking distance of Truk. He gave the order Operation Hailstone, February 17 and 18. Tactical command of the 5th Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance, 57 years old, the man who had won at Midway, newly promoted to 4 stars just 13 days earlier. Direct command of the carriers under Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, 57 years old, the old aviator with a face like a leather glove, whose pilots called him Pete. 9 carriers, 6 battleships, 10 cruisers, 28 destroyers, over 500 combat aircraft. The largest fast carrier task force ever assembled in one place in the history of warfare up to that moment. And on a ridge above a small volcanic island in the middle of that lagoon, 90 miles from where Task Force 58 was, steaming through the blackness, another man was already awake. His name was Masami Kobayashi. He was 53 years old. He was a vice admiral in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was the commander of the 4th Fleet at Truk. He had been born in the summer of 1890 in a place called Yonezawa in Yamagata Prefecture in the snow country of northern Japan. His father was a farmer. He had entered the Naval Academy in 1907 with the help of a network of senior admirals from his home region, the same regional patronage network that had, 3 years earlier, opened the same door for a boy from the same city, born 3 years before him, who would grow up to command the Japanese carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor. That boy's name was Chuichi Nagumo. Kobayashi had graduated 4th out of a class of 149 cadets. He had gone to sea. He had commanded destroyers, then cruisers, then a naval district. He had spent 4 years of his career living in the United States as a naval attaché based in Washington. He had traveled through the industrial cities of the American East and Midwest in the middle of the Great Depression, when American factories were rusting and idle, and he had understood, even then, what those factories would produce if they were ever fully awakened. He had come home from those tours with reports. He had written those reports in careful ideographic script and submitted them to the Navy Ministry in Tokyo. Nobody in Tokyo had ever done anything with them. By 1943, when the Navy Ministry finally sent Kobayashi to Truk to command the 4th Fleet, he was one of a small number of senior Japanese officers who understood in his bones what an American industrial mobilization actually was. They called Truk the Gibraltar of the Pacific. Every message from Tokyo used those words. Gibraltar, fortress, untouchable. Kobayashi knew what Truk really was. Truk was a parking lot. Beautiful, warm, dotted with palm trees, almost completely indefensible against the kind of enemy he had seen with his own eyes in America a decade and a half earlier. He stood at the window of his headquarters on Dublin Island. The lagoon below him was dark. A few ships at anchor, a generator humming somewhere in the distance, a cooking fire on one of the outer islands. Everything looked exactly the way it should look. Kobayashi did not trust any of it. Because 13 days earlier, at 9 in the morning on February 4, 1944, 2 American Marine Corps PD-4Y1 Liberator bombers had appeared high over Truk at 30,000 feet. Course 090 departing east. The photographs those 2 aircraft brought back to a base in the Solomon Islands had changed everything. Kobayashi had received the report of that flight before breakfast on February 4. He had read it twice. He had walked to this same window. He had looked down at this same lagoon, and he had understood in the space of 5 seconds what those two aircraft meant. Two Liberator bombers at 30,000 feet, 900 miles from the nearest American airfield, did not fly to Truk to Site C. They flew to Truk to build the target map. Kobayashi had picked up the telephone. He had asked for a direct line to Palau, 1,300 miles to the west, because at his own headquarters, another man was waiting for the same news. That man was Admiral Minechi Koga, 58 years old, Commander-in-Chief of the entire Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet, the man who had inherited that title from Saisoroku Yamamoto after Yamamoto had been shot down over Bougainville the previous April. Koga had already begun to move his flagship, the super battleship Musashi, away from Truk in the weeks before. Fuel was scarce. American submarines were everywhere. When he heard about the American reconnaissance flight, he made his decision within the hour. He sent the order to Kobayashi that same day, withdraw all major fleet units from Truk effective immediately. Musashi, all operational fleet carriers, all heavy cruisers. Every ship that could actually fight a fleet action, some to Palau, some including Musashi with Koga himself embarked all the way back to Yokosuka in Japan. Fourth Fleet will remain at Truk with available forces. Kobayashi had read the message in silence for a long time, because he understood what the order meant. Koga was pulling out the pieces that mattered. He was leaving Kobayashi behind with what was left: tankers, transports, ammunition ships, repair ships, light cruisers, so old they were nearly obsolete, destroyers held together with rust and salt water. The Americans came, Kobayashi would fight them with a fleet of ghosts. He had folded the order carefully, he had placed it in the pocket of his uniform. He had walked back to the window and looked down at the great ships that were still at anchor. For now, in 6 days, they had begun slipping out through the reef passages in the night. By February 10, the last of them was gone. Musashi had sailed north with Koga still aboard, bound for Japan. Kobayashi had stood on this same ridge and watched the future of the Imperial Japanese Navy sail away from him without turning back, without a farewell signal, without a word. That had been 13 days ago. Now it was 3 in the morning on February 17, 944, and Task Force 58 was 90 miles from the reef. Kobayashi walked out onto the concrete observation platform outside his headquarters. His chief of staff was somewhere behind him in the dark. Neither man spoke. The lagoon below them was quiet. He wanted to trust it. He could not. He had ordered the air groups to double their patrols the week before. He had ordered anti-aircraft crews to sleep near their guns. And the officers under him had said, "Yes, admirals. Yes, admiral. Of course. Admiral." And then they had done half of what he asked. Because after months of quiet, the men of Truk had stopped believing the Americans would ever come. The pilots of the 22nd and 26th Air Flotillas had been on high alert for weeks. They were tired. Their commanders had let most of them go ashore to rest. Truk had no working early warning radar to speak of. Every operator on the island knew it. Nobody had fixed it. Kobayashi raised his binoculars. He looked east. The horizon was flat and black and empty. There was nothing out there. 90 miles away, moving toward that same horizon at 20 knots, 500 American aircraft were being fueled and armed in the darkness. The men who would fly them were writing letters to their mothers and their wives and their fiancés. They were smoking cigarettes on the flight decks. They were checking radios. They were checking guns. They were sitting in ready rooms with maps of Truk Lagoon pinned to the walls and coffee cups going cold in their hands. Dave Colley was climbing into the back seat of a Dauntless dive bomber. James Ramage was tapping a piece of chalk against a circle on a chalkboard. Chester Nimitz was 3,000 miles away in a quiet office in Pearl Harbor, drinking coffee, waiting for the first radio report. Masami Kobayashi was standing on a ridge above Dublon Island in the dark, looking east and seeing nothing. The sky was empty for another hour and 43 minutes. The first Hellcat came off the deck of the USS Yorktown at 4:43 in the morning. It was still dark. The pilot was a young man in a leather flight jacket who had been awake since 2:30. He had eaten a breakfast of powdered eggs and black coffee in a wardroom full of other men who were not talking. He had sat through a briefing where a lieutenant commander had stood in front of a map of Truk Lagoon and used the word unknown more times than he had used any other word. He climbed into the cockpit of a Grumman F-6F Hellcat. 7.5 tons of American aluminum, 2,000 horsepower, 650 caliber machine gun, painted deep blue on the top and light gray underneath, so it disappeared against the ocean from above and against the sky from below. The catapult officer raised a lantern. The engine roared. The Hellcat lunged down the deck and out over the black water and was gone. Then another one came off, then another, then two at once. By 5 o'clock in the morning on February 17, 1,944 72 Grumman Hellcats were airborne over the Pacific Ocean. They were flying west in loose sections at 200 feet above the water. Their engines were the only sound in the world. They were going to arrive before the sun did. At 6 in the morning, on the observation platform above Dublon Island, Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi was still awake. He had not slept. He was drinking green tea from a small cup that his hands were not shaking. He was 53 years old. He had been in this navy since he was 20. He turned his head to the east. He heard it before he saw it. A low sound at first, almost like wind, but it was not wind. It was continuous, it was mechanical, it was coming from a direction the wind did not come from at this time of year. He raised his binoculars. The horizon was starting to turn grey. And in the grey, moving very fast, very low, in loose formations of 4 and 8 and 12, were the shapes of American aircraft. Kobayashi did not lower the binoculars. He watched because there was nothing else he could do. At 6:08 in the morning, the first Grumman F-6F Hellcat crossed the reef of Truk Lagoon at 200 feet above the water. It was flying at 300 miles an hour. It rolled slightly to the left, lined up on the airfield at Eaton Island, and opened fire. The airfield at Eaton was still asleep. Rows of Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters sat parked wingtip to wingtip on the concrete apron. Fuel trucks were parked next to them. A Betty medium bomber was taxiing for a dawn patrol takeoff, its engines idling. The Hellcat's 650 caliber guns fired for less than 2 seconds. The first Zero exploded. The one next to it caught fire. The fuel truck between them went up in a fireball 50 feet high. The Betty bomber caught a burst of tracer fire directly through the cockpit and rolled to a stop with smoke pouring out of its shattered canopy, and its pilot slumped over the yoke. The Hellcat pulled up, banked hard right, and dove again. Behind it, another Hellcat was already coming down, and another, and another. On the perimeter of the field, a Japanese mechanic was walking across the flight line with a wrench in his hand. He had been coming to fix a radio on the Betty bomber. He had not heard the aircraft coming. He heard them now. He turned around. He never made it to cover. A single 50 caliber round went through him at 300 miles an hour, and he was dead before he hit the concrete. Within the first 30 minutes of the fight, more than 30 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, most of them on the ground. A handful managed to get airborne. The pilots of the 22nd and 26th Air Flotillas, who had been on shore leave the night before, who had been drinking steak and playing cards and sleeping in barracks a mile from their aircraft, ran across the flight line in their underwear, trying to reach cockpits that were already burning. The Zeros that did get airborne climbed straight into the guns of a fighter that had been designed to outclass them. The Hellcat had entered service 6 months earlier, built from the ground up to answer the Japanese Zero. American engineers had also studied a captured Zero, salvaged from an Aleutian island in the summer of 1942, and they had used what they learned to refine the tactics American pilots would fly against it. The Hellcat was faster, its guns fired heavier bullets. It was, quite literally, an American answer to a Japanese question, and that morning over Truk Lagoon, it delivered the answer at 300 miles an hour. The Zeros were shot down as fast as they climbed. At 6:30, the strike aircraft arrived. Wave after wave of them. SPD Dauntless dive bombers falling out of the sky at 70-degree angles, TBF Avenger torpedo bombers skimming the water at 50 feet, more Hellcats above them hunting anything that tried to move. The lagoon was 38 miles wide. There were 40-plus Japanese ships anchored inside it. None of them was Musashi. At 6:47 in the morning, 3,000 feet above the anchorage, Lieutenant James Ramage rolled his SPD Dauntless over onto its back and started down. He was 27 years old. He was looking for the largest battleship in the world. His dive brakes came out. His engine howled. He rode the vertical line down through anti-aircraft fire that was starting to come up from the shore batteries, and he looked through his gun sight at the water below him, and he did not see what he had come to see. There was no Musashi, there was no Yamato, there were no fleet carriers, there were no heavy cruisers. There were tankers, there were merchant ships, there was a burning airfield in the distance, but the giants of the combined fleet were gone, and Ramage pulled up out of his dive at 1,500 feet without releasing his bomb. Climbed back up, he circled. He looked again, then he understood. Every pilot in the air group understood the same thing at almost the same moment. The battleships they had come 700 miles to sink had slipped out of the lagoon before the raid began. The chalkboard in the ready room of the Enterprise had been wrong. The intelligence photographs from February 4 had been out of date the moment they were developed. Musashi was already halfway back to Japan, but the lagoon was still full. Tankers, ammunition ships, aircraft, transports. Everything that fed the Japanese war machine in the South Pacifics was still sitting down there in warm, shallow water. Ramage keyed his radio. New target, he said. He rolled over and dove again. This time on a fleet oiler called Hoyo Maru, his 1,000-pound bomb went straight down her stack. At 8:15 in the morning, another SPD Avenger section from the USS Intrepid crossed the eastern edge of the lagoon at 3,000 feet. The lead aircraft was a TBF-1C Avenger. Its pilot was Lieutenant James E. Bridges of Torpedo Squadron 6. He was 26 years old. He had a gunner and a radioman behind him, both younger than he was, both about to die. Bridges saw his target through the morning haze, Iikoku Maru, 10,438 tons. A converted passenger liner, now serving as an armed merchant cruiser loaded to the gunwales with ammunition and troops bound for Rabaul. She was anchored 2 miles off Dublon Island. Bridges rolled his Avenger over, dropped down to 200 feet, and drove straight in. His torpedo hit the Iikoku Maru amidships. It went off in the ammunition magazine. The explosion was seen from 30 miles away. There was a white flash first, then a rolling column of black smoke half a mile high. The Iikoku Maru broke in two. Her bow section rolled over and sank in less than 60 seconds. Her stern section burned on the surface for another minute, then went down after it. Of the 1,345 human beings aboard Iikoku Maru that morning, more than 1,000 died in the span of 2 minutes. Some handful were picked out of the burning water hours later. Lieutenant James E. Bridges and his 2 crewmen were killed by their own blast. Their Avenger was seen veering out of control to the northeast of the explosion. It was never recovered. The Navy carried them as missing in action for the next 70 years. On the ridge above Dublin Island, Kobayashi lowered his binoculars for the first time that morning. For a long moment, he simply stood there. Then he raised the binoculars again, because the sky was full of American aircraft and there was nothing else he could do. The morning became an assembly line. That is the word American pilots used for it later. Not a battle, not a raid, an assembly line. They came in groups of 6 or 8. They picked a ship. They dropped their bombs. They pulled up and climbed away and let the next group have their turn. The Fujikawa Maru, an aircraft transport with replacement Zeros stacked in her holds, took multiple hits and settled by the Nippo Maru, a cargo ship loaded with tanks and artillery for the garrison, was hit amidships and burned for hours before sinking. The Kiyosumi Maru, an armed merchant cruiser, took 3 bomb hits and slid under with her engines. Still, the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners fired until their barrels turned red. Some of them fired until their barrels warped. Some of them died at their guns. The American aircraft kept coming every 4 minutes, every 3 minutes, every 2 minutes. At 10 in the morning, on the concrete platform above Dublon Island, a young officer approached Vice Admiral Kobayashi with a message. Kobayashi read it without expression. He handed it back. He turned to face the lagoon again. Half of it was burning. The other half was going to be. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 40 miles northwest of Truk, a Japanese task group made a run for open water. They had left the lagoon at 4:30 in the morning, before the American attack began, hoping to slip out into the empty ocean and disappear north. They had almost made it. They had not made it far enough. The task group consisted of the light cruiser Katori, the armed merchant cruiser Akagi Maru, 2 destroyers named Maikaze and Nawaki, and a minesweeping trawler. The Katori was a training cruiser, 22 years old, 5,890 tons, armed with 4 elderly 6-inch guns. She had been at Truk because there was nowhere else for her to be. American aircraft found the group at first light. They hit the Akagi Maru with 3 bombs. The armed merchant cruiser caught fire, exploded, and abandoned herself in the water with more than 1,000 men still aboard. They hit the Katori with a torpedo and 7 bombs. The old training cruiser slowed to a crawl. Her steering was gone. Her forward turret was out of action. She was still floating, but only barely. The Japanese destroyer captain of the Maikaze made his decision. He turned around. He turned his destroyer directly into the path of the incoming American surface force, and he prepared to fight to the last shell in his ready lockers. The American surface force was already on the horizon. It consisted of the brand new fast battleships USS New Jersey and USS Iowa. Each of them weighed 45,000 tons. Each of them carried 9 16-inch guns, each shell of which weighed as much as a small car. The heavy cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans were with them, mounting 8-inch guns. 4 destroyers screened the flank, and standing on the bridge of the USS New Jersey in a khaki uniform and a soft blue cap was a man who almost never left his flagship carrier. His name was Raymond Spruance. He was 57 years old. He was the commander of the 5th Fleet. He had won the Battle of Midway. 13 days earlier, he had been promoted from Vice Admiral to Full Admiral, 4 stars on each shoulder, and the promotion order had been signed personally by President Franklin Roosevelt. He was quiet. He was often called cold. He was famous for staying with his aircraft carriers, letting his air groups do the killing, refusing to be drawn into surface engagements that could be handled with airplanes. At Truk, on the afternoon of February 17, 1944, he made an exception. He wanted to sink a Japanese warship with 16-inch guns. Personally, he had been thinking about this since Pearl Harbor. Every officer in his command knew it. On the bridge of the New Jersey that afternoon, he did not smile, he did not speak, he simply nodded when the range to the Katori was reported at 20,000 yards, and the New Jersey's main battery director rotated with a low mechanical groan, and the 9 16-inch guns lifted their muzzles toward the horizon in perfect synchronization. At 1:13 in the afternoon, the New Jersey opened fire. 9 shells went out in the first salvo. The columns of water they raised straddled the Katori, the second salve hit her, the third salvo tore off her stern. The heavy cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans opened fire from the flank with 8-inch guns. The Katori shuddered, listed to port, and began to sink. The destroyer Meikaze fired her torpedoes. They ran true. They passed between the New Jersey and the Iowa, close enough to be seen from both ships. They ran on into empty ocean and detonated on nothing. The Meikaze was answered by American 5-inch guns. She was cut apart in less than 4 minutes. She sank with her flag still flying. Every man aboard her went down with her, still firing at the American ships as her decks went under. At 1:43 in the afternoon, the Katori rolled onto her port side, showed her red-painted bottom to the sky, and disappeared. She took Captain Tamekiyo Oda and every one of her crew with her. American sailors on the New Jersey looked down into the water as they steamed past the wreckage and saw men still alive in the debris waving. The New Jersey did not stop. None of the American ships stopped. They kept moving north. This was the first time in the history of the United States Navy that a 4-star admiral had personally participated in a surface engagement aboard one of the fighting ships. Raymond Spruance stood on the bridge and watched the survivors disappear behind him and did not change his expression. At 3 in the afternoon, back inside the lagoon, the raid continued. At 4, it was still continuing. At sundown on the ridge above Dublon Island, Vice Admiral Kobayashi finally set his binoculars down on a small wooden table beside him. His hands were steady, his face was calm. His uniform was soaked through with sweat because he had been standing in the sun for 11 hours without moving. The lagoon below him was on fire, not part of it, all of it. 40 ships, 250 aircraft, 17,000 tons of aviation fuel. And somewhere out there in the burning water, 4,500 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and merchant seamen who had woken up that morning expecting to eat breakfast. Kobayashi turned to his chief of staff. He said, in a voice that was almost gentle, "Send this to Palau." Then he walked back into his headquarters and sat down at his desk and began to write a message that ended his career. 10:15 that night, 40 miles east of Truk, a single Japanese aircraft came out of the darkness at 50 feet above the water. It was a Nakajima B-6N Jill, single-engine, carrier-type torpedo bomber. Fast, low, hard to see against the black water. The pilot had trained specifically for night attacks on. He had launched from a shore base and flown for hours through radar shadow, alone searching for the American fleet by dead reckoning and by the reflected glow of shipboard fires he could see on the eastern horizon. He found the USS Intrepid. The Intrepid was one of the newest aircraft carriers in the American fleet, Essex class, 27,000 tons. 90-plus aircraft aboard. She had been commissioned 6 months earlier. Her captain was a man named Thomas Sprague, no relation to Raymond Spruance, 49 years old, standing on the bridge in the dark. The Jill pilot lined up his run. He was flying at 50 feet above the water. The Intrepid was moving at 25 knots. He came in at a shallow angle from her starboard quarter. American radar picked him up. The combat air patrol tried to intercept. He dropped even lower to 20 feet, and the Capel lost him against the sea return. He released his torpedo at 300 yards. The torpedo ran true. It struck the Intrepid on the starboard quarter, 15 feet below her waterline. The blast flooded 3 compartments. It jammed her rudder hard to port. 11 American sailors were killed instantly. 17 more were wounded. The Intrepid began to circle uncontrollably in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, steaming at 15 knots in a wide, helpless arc, unable to turn out of it, her bow slowly swinging around to point directly at Tokyo. Captain Sprague fought his ship. For 3 hours, he raced his port screw and idled his starboard engine to hold a course. His damage control parties worked in the flooded compartments with the water rising around them. When the wind rose and threatened to swing her back toward the Japanese home islands, Sprague ordered the crew to rig a sail out of hatch covers and canvas. They rigged a sail on an aircraft carrier. The Intrepid limped east under makeshift canvas, and she survived the night. She would be out of the war for 6 months. She would sail all the way back to San Francisco Bay for repairs at Hunters Point Naval Shipyard. The Jill pilot who scored the hit turned east into the darkness after his attack and vanished. His name has never been confirmed. His body was never found. It was the only Japanese victory of the entire operation. 6 hours after the torpedo hit the Intrepid in a ready room on the USS Enterprise, another chapter of American naval history was already being written. Lieutenant Commander William Mice Martin was standing in front of 12 pilots and their crews. He was 35 years old, he was quiet, he was thin, he wore steel-rimmed glasses, he looked like a school teacher. He was about to make American naval history. For 6 months, Bill Martin had been fighting the United States Navy for permission to try something no American pilot had ever done in combat before. He wanted to launch a torpedo bomber attack from an aircraft carrier at night, using nothing but airborne radar to find the targets. Every senior officer he had spoken to had told him it would get his crews killed. He had persuaded Rear Admiral Mitchell anyway. The men in front of him called themselves the Buzzard Brigade. They had trained on instrument flying for months, they had trained on radar interpretation, they had trained on low-altitude formation work in the dark. Martin himself would not lead the strike that night. The Navy had ruled that he was too valuable, too irreplaceable. He would stay on the Enterprise. Command of the airborne strike would fall to his executive officer, Lieutenant Van Eason. At 4:13 in the morning on February 18, 1944, 12 TBF-1C Avengers catapulted off the deck of the USS Enterprise into a sky so black their wingtips were invisible from 10 feet away. Each Avenger carried 4 500-pound bombs. They flew west, they dropped to 200 feet above the ocean. They picked their way through squalls in the dark, using nothing but their instrument panels and their onboard radar sets, and 1 hour and 18 minutes later they arrived over Truk Lagoon at masthead height. The Japanese anti-aircraft crews on Dublon Island heard engines, could not seize anything. The Avengers came in one at a time, each pilot picked a radar return, adjusted his heading, and released bombs at 50 feet above the water in complete darkness. There was no visual aiming, there was no coordination between aircraft. Each man flew alone in the dark, releasing weapons based on a green line on a small screen and his own instinct. It should not have worked. It worked. 13 Japanese ships were sunk or damaged by 12 airplanes in the space of 90 minutes in the middle of the night. The Buzzard Brigade turned east and went home. It was the first successful nighttime carrier strike against ships in the history of naval warfare. Within 18 months, the tactic would be standard doctrine in the United States Navy. At sunrise on February 18, 1944, Vice Admiral Kobayashi walked out onto the concrete platform above Dublon Island for the last time. The lagoon below him was still burning. His chief of staff stood behind him and did not speak. Kobayashi lifted a small pair of binoculars and looked east. There was nothing left to see. The Americans had brought everything they had, and they had taken everything back with them. He lowered the binoculars. He walked back inside. He sat down at his desk to wait for the message from Tokyo that he already knew was coming. The last American aircraft left the sky over Truk Lagoon at 4:30 in the afternoon on February 18, 1944. There was no farewell salvo, no radio message, no signal of victory. The strike planes simply climbed east into the sun, formed up in loose sections, and disappeared over the horizon. Task Force 58 turned its bows toward the anchorage at Majuro and vanished the same way it had arrived, silently, efficiently, on a schedule. Behind them, the lagoon burned into the night. When the smoke cleared, the numbers were the kind of numbers historians would argue about for the next 80 years. 40 ships on the bottom, 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, 20-plus merchant vessels and auxiliaries, tankers, ammunition ships, aircraft transports. 250 aircraft destroyed, most of them on the ground, most of them in the first 3 hours. 17,000 tons of aviation fuel gone, 4,500 Japanese sailors, soldiers, and merchant seamen dead. The Americans had lost 25 aircraft, 40 men, 1 aircraft carrier temporarily out of action. That was the arithmetic. Admiral Raymond Spruance sent a signal to Washington that night. It was 11 words long. It ran in newspapers across America the following week. Pacific Fleet has returned to Truk, the visit made by the Japanese fleet at Pearl Harbor. 26 months, 10 days, and 11 hours after the first Japanese torpedo hit the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941, America had come to collect. On the ridge above Dublon Island, Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi waited. He sat at his desk. He drank tea. He did not eat. His chief of staff came in with routine reports and left without a word. The junior officers on his staff avoided his door. Somewhere below, on the shore, the last survivors from Bridges' target were being carried to a field hospital that no longer had walls. The message from Tokyo arrived 2 days later. It was February 21, 1944. Came on a single sheet of paper, coded, decoded, typed clean, delivered by a young signal officer who could not look his commanding admiral in the eye. The Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff relieves Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi of command of the 4th Fleet, effective immediately. That was it. No hearing, no inquiry, no opportunity to explain that the battleships had been pulled out of Truk before the Americans came, that the carriers had been ordered to Palau by Admiral Koga himself, that the fleet Kobayashi had been left to defend Truk with had been gone by the time the first Hellcat crossed the reef. Someone had to be blamed. He was the closest. Kobayashi read the order once. He folded it carefully. He placed it in the same pocket of his uniform where he had placed Koga's withdrawal order 13 days earlier. Then he stood up. He walked to the window one last time. He looked down at the lagoon, at the wrecks visible in the shallows, at the smoke still rising in thin columns from ships that had been burning for 3 days. He looked for a long time. Then he turned around and started packing. He would leave Truk within the week. He would return to Japan on a naval transport that took him first to Rabaul, then to Manila, then to Yokosuka. He would arrive in Tokyo in early April. He would report to the Navy Ministry. He would salute his superiors. He would say nothing about what had happened. On May 31, 1944, he would be placed on the reserve list. His 34-year career in the Imperial Japanese Navy would end without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without a single word from the admirals who had sent him to Truk to fail. He would live another 33 years. He would die in a quiet neighborhood in Tokyo on August 7, 1977, at the age of 87. In all those years, in every interview he gave, in every conversation with old naval friends, in every private letter and every public statement, he would never once speak publicly about what had happened at Truk in February 1944. There was nothing left to say. 2 weeks after Hailstone, Tokyo made a decision that told the whole world how Japan planned to fight the rest of the war. On March 4, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy activated a new command called the Central Pacific Area Fleet. Its purpose was to defend the Mariana Islands, Palau, and everything east of the Philippines. Its headquarters was placed on the island of Saipan, 700 miles north of the ruins of Truk. The man Tokyo chose to command it was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. He was 56 years old. He was the man who had commanded the Japanese carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941, the architect of the attack that had started this war. The man who had personally launched 414 aircraft against the American fleet in Hawaii and had watched the American battle line burn. He was being sent forward now to command the last line of defense before the Japanese home islands. The man who had opened the war was being sent to close it. And here is a thing that most biographers do not mention. Nagumo and Kobayashi had been born in the same city, Yonezawa, Yamagata Prefecture, the snow country of northern Japan. 3 years apart. They had grown up on the same streets, they had known the same admirals, they had entered the same navy through the same regional patronage network. The clique of Yonezawa admirals that had opened the door to the Naval Academy for a young man named Nagumo in 1904 had opened the same door for a younger boy named Kobayashi. 37 years later, both of them were on their way out of the war. One of them was already on the reserve list, the other one was heading to Saipan to die. At the end of March 1944, at 10 o'clock at night on March 31, 2 Kawanishi H-8K flying boats lifted off from a lagoon in the Palau Islands and turned west toward the Philippines. They were flying at low altitude. They were carrying the entire strategic leadership of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet. The first aircraft carried Admiral Minechi Koga, 58 years old, Commander-in-Chief of the entire Combined Fleet. The man who had ordered the withdrawal from Truk, Yamamoto's successor. The second aircraft carried Koga's Chief of Staff, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, and a leather briefcase. The briefcase contained a document called Z Sakusen, Operation Z. It was Japan's entire strategic plan for the naval defense of the inner defense perimeter. It was the blueprint for the decisive battle the Combined Fleet had been preparing to fight since Yamamoto's death. Both aircraft flew into a tropical typhoon over the Philippine Sea an hour after takeoff. Koga's aircraft vanished, no wreckage, no survivors, no trace. Commander-in-Chief of the entire Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet simply disappeared into the ocean somewhere between Palau and Davao and was never seen again. Japan would not officially announce his death for 5 weeks. The second aircraft carrying Fukudome and the briefcase crashed off the coast of Cebu Island. Fukudome survived. He was pulled from the water at dawn by Filipino guerrillas who did not know who he was. His briefcase was pulled out with him. The guerrillas held the wet leather case for several days. They did not know what they had. When they opened it and saw the Japanese characters on the papers inside, they gave it to their local commander, who gave it to an American intelligence officer, who gave it to the United States 6th Army headquarters in Australia. By mid-May 1944, translated copies of Operation Z were on the desk of Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. 6 weeks after Truk had been erased, the Americans knew exactly how Japan planned to fight the rest of the war in the Pacific. 2 months after Hailstone, the Japanese Combined Fleet had lost its commander-in-chief and its master war plan. The dominoes had begun to fall. They were not going to stop. On June 15, 1944, 4 months after Truk, American Marines came ashore on the southwestern beaches of Saipan. From the observation tower north of the invasion beaches, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo watched them come. According to his yeoman, a man named Mitsuharu Noda, who survived the battle and gave testimony to American investigators after the war, Nagumo stood on that tower for a long time and stared at the American battleships lying offshore. He pointed at one of them. He said quietly to Noda, "I sank her at Pearl Harbor." He pointed at another. "That one too." He said no more, because he was looking at ships he had personally destroyed on the morning of December 7, 9,941 battleships he had watched burn at their moorings, while his own pilots flew home to the Kido Butai in triumph. Battleships that were supposed to be dead. They had been salvaged, they had been rebuilt, they had crossed 4,000 miles of ocean to shell the beaches of Saipan over his. The war had come full circle in 2.5 years. The Battle of Saipan lasted 3 weeks. American aircraft flew from Task Force 58 overhead. Marines advanced across the sugarcane fields. Naval gunfire from the battleships Nagumo had once thought he had killed pounded the Japanese positions into dust. On the northern tip of the island, at a place the American Marines were beginning to call Marpi Point, Japanese civilians began to walk off the cliffs into the sea rather than surrender. On July 6, 1944, in a small cave near the northern town of Marpi, at a place American Marines would soon mark on their maps as Hill 500, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo took his own life. He did not use the traditional seppuku ceremony. He used a pistol. He put the barrel of a small-caliber Japanese service pistol against his right temple, and he pulled the trigger. His body was found later by American Marines advancing north. He was 57 years old. The man who had launched the Pacific War had come full circle, from attacker to defender, from glory to ruin. From the bridge of the fleet carrier Akagi at dawn on December 7, 1941, to the floor of a cave on Saipan in the last hour of his life. 2.5 years, that was how fast the war had turned. Between June 19 and June 20, 1944, in the waters west of the Marianas, the Japanese combined fleet made its last stand. It was called the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese carrier force. He had 9 aircraft carriers. He had 473 combat aircraft. His pilots were young. Most of them had graduated from flight school in the last 4 months. Some of them had fewer than 100 hours in their logbooks. The Americans had 15 aircraft carriers. They had 956 aircraft. The American pilots had trained for 2 years. They flew Hellcats and Avengers and Helldivers that were faster, tougher, and better armed than anything the Japanese could put in the sky. In 2 days over the Philippine Sea, Ozawa lost more than 600 aircraft. He lost 3 aircraft carriers. One of them was Taiho, brand new, 29,000 tons, considered unsinkable, torpedoed by the American submarine Albacore, consumed by a fuel vapor explosion so violent she was gone in 90 minutes. Another was Shokaku, the oldest survivor of the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, the last of Nagumo's original carriers, torpedoed by the American submarine Kavala, sunk in 300 fathoms of water with 2,000 men aboard. The American pilots called the battle the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Every one of the pilots the Japanese lost that day had been trained in a program that Truk was supposed to protect. Every ship they lost had been counting on Truk for fuel and repair. Every aircraft they lost had once been supposed to stage through Truk on its way to the front. There was no Truk anymore. There was only a ring of coral around a graveyard of ships. Saipan fell in July, Tinian fell in August, Guam fell shortly after. From those 3 islands in November 1944, the United States began flying B-29 Superfortress bombers directly against the home islands of Japan. 4 months later, from the same 3 islands, Curtis LeMay switched from precision bombing to firebombing. On the night of March 9, 1945, 334 B-29s took off from Saipan and Tinian carrying incendiary bombs. They flew to Tokyo, they dropped 1,500 tons of napalm, they killed 100,000 Japanese civilians in a single night. 6 months after that, on the morning of August 6, 1945, a single B-29 took off from Tinian carrying a single bomb. Its name was Enola Gay. Its target was Hiroshima. The runway that B-29 rolled down on the morning of August 6 was just over 1,000 miles from the burning lagoon where Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi had stood 18 months earlier and watched his ships sink. The bombers came from the islands he had been unable to defend. He would not have been surprised, and 40,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen were still trapped on Truk. The Americans never came back to invade. They did not have to. Truk had been erased as a strategic asset. Admiral Nimitz called the policy withering on the vine. The atoll was simply left in the American rear as the war moved west. For the men still living on those islands, that policy meant something specific. It meant starvation. American submarines cut off every supply run. American aircraft from passing carriers regularly returned to bomb whatever new construction the garrison attempted. But there was no invasion, there was no siege, there was no dramatic final battle. There was only hunger. By the summer of 1944, the men of Truk were catching fish with hand grenades to save ammunition. By the winter of 1944, they were eating rats. By the spring of 1945. Nobody counted them exactly. Nobody in Tokyo asked. The commander of that dying garrison was another man now. His name was Vice Admiral Chuichi Hara. He was 55 years old. He had arrived in November 1944 after Nagumo's suicide, after the collapse of the Central Pacific Area Fleet. He inherited what was left, a base with no ships, airfields, with no aircraft, a command with no purpose except to keep his men alive until someone in Tokyo remembered they existed. Nobody remembered. In those last 10 months of the war, Hara watched thousands of men under his command starve to death on islands that had once housed the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. On September 2, 1945, the same morning that General Douglas MacArthur accepted the Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Vice Admiral Chuichi Hara stood on the deck of the heavy cruiser USS Portland in Truk Lagoon and signed his own surrender. He signed on behalf of every Japanese serviceman still alive on the atoll. There were far fewer of them than there had been a year earlier. He would be tried for war crimes at Guam for the execution of American airmen during his command. He would serve 6 years in prison. He would die in Japan in 1964. That was how it ended. Not with a battle, not with a last stand, not with a banzai charge across a beach. With a signature on a piece of paper on the deck of an American cruiser in a lagoon full of Japanese ships that had been underwater for 18 months. The lagoon is still there. It is called Chuuk now. The country around it is the Federated States of Micronesia. The population is small. The economy is quiet. The tourists who come to Chuuk do not come for the beaches. They come because Truk Lagoon is the largest underwater ship graveyard in the world. More than 40 Japanese vessels sunk in February 1944 still sit exactly where they went down. Warm, shallow water, clear enough to see the deck plates. Divers glide through the crew quarters of the Fujikawa Maru. They swim past the mess tables of the San Francisco Maru with rifles and gas masks still visible in the holds. They pass through the engine rooms of the Nippo Maru with the ship's telegraph still set to the last order it received before the bombs came down. Bottles of Kirin beer still sit on the tables in the crew galleys. A ceramic cup rests on a shelf near a helmsman's station. A field telephone lies on a bunk, the receiver still in its cradle. Everything is exactly where it was at the moment the water came in on the morning of February 17, 1944. Nobody moved it. Nobody could. Thousands of Japanese sailors and merchant seamen are still down there. The Japanese government has never made a serious effort to recover them. There are too many, too deep, too tangled in the wrecks. In Japanese naval tradition, a sailor who goes down with his ship belongs to the ship. He is not to be disturbed. They belong to those ships now. That is what Japan did next. They blamed one admiral. They sent the architect of Pearl Harbor forward to command a doomed defense line on Saipan, and they buried him in a cave 3 months later. They lost their commander-in-chief in a storm and their master war plan to a Filipino fisherman. They sent their last pilots into the Marianas and watched them die in a turkey shoot. They gave up the Marianas and with them the sky over Tokyo, and they left 40,000 of their own men to starve on an island they had once called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. But this story does not end with Japan. 40 American servicemen were killed at Truk during Operation Hailstone. 25 American aircraft were lost. Their names are on memorials in Honolulu and on cemetery walls in small towns from Maine to Oregon. For 80 years, most of them were listed as missing in action. Their families were told there was nobody to bring home. There was only the Pacific. Then, beginning around 2019, a team from an American organization called Project Recover began locating United States Navy aircraft on the floor of the lagoon. 3 of them at first, more in the years that followed additional surveys as recent as 2024. Each aircraft they found still contained crew members listed as missing since February 1944. Their families were notified. Some of them, now in their 80s and their 90s, were still alive to receive the news that their older brother or their uncle, or the father they had never met, had been found. Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi died in a small apartment in Tokyo in the summer of 1977. He had spent his last 25 years quietly training a new generation of Japanese sailors, first at Sugamo Prison, where the Allies held him until 1983 952, and then as an instructor for the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force. In none of those years, in no lecture, in no interview, in no private letter that has ever surfaced, did he speak publicly about what happened at Truk in February 1944. His obituary in the Japanese press was one paragraph long, retired 1944. No mention of the harbor, no mention of the fleet he had been left to defend with no ships, no mention of the years he had spent walking American cities in the 1930s, watching a country he understood far better than his own admirals ever would. America fought with factories that never slept, he had seen it. Nobody in Tokyo had listened until it was too late. Dave Colley lived to be an old man. He gave his oral history to the United States Navy. He spoke about the morning he had flown into Truk in the back seat of a dauntless dive bomber and had not expected to come home. He spoke plainly, the way men of his generation did. He did not embellish, he did not dramatize, he simply told what he saw. Lieutenant James Ramage went on to become a rear admiral in the United States Navy. He commanded ships, he taught younger officers. He lived a long life of quiet service. He died in California in 2012 at the age of 95. Rear Admiral Mark Mitchell took Task Force 58 all the way across the Pacific from Truk to Tokyo Bay in the 18 months that followed Hailstone. He died in 1947 at the age of 60. The war had worn him out. Admiral Raymond Spruance retired in 1948. He served as president of the Naval War College. He served as ambassador to the Philippines. He died in California in 1969, and he is buried near his old friend and rival Mark Mitchell at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno. The USS Enterprise, the carrier Dave Colley had flown from, went on to serve in every major Pacific campaign until the end of the war. She was the most decorated American warship of the Second World War. She was scrapped in 1958. Her name was carried forward, first by a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier that served through the Cold War, later by a starship on television. The USS Intrepid, the carrier that took the torpedo on the night of February 17, was repaired at Hunters Point and returned to the war within 6 months. She served in the United States Navy for another 30 years and has stood as a floating museum on the west side of Manhattan for more than 40 years since. Today, she is a museum on the west side of Manhattan in New York City. Visitors can walk her decks. They can see the compartment where the Jill's torpedo hit. They can stand at the rail on a spring afternoon and look out at the Hudson River and try to imagine what it was like to be 22 years old in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in a fleet that had come 7,000 miles to answer for Pearl Harbor. That is what the men who flew Operation Hailstone paid for. They paid for the right of an American grandfather to stand on the deck of the Intrepid on the west side of Manhattan and read the names of the men who did not come home. They paid for the right of a Japanese fisherman to run a small tourboat over the wrecks in Chuuk Lagoon 80 years later and to tell the tourists, in careful English, exactly what happened here on the morning of February 17, 1944. They paid for the right of the sons and daughters and grandchildren of the men who never came home to receive a phone call. Sometime in the last 5 years, from a man who said quietly, "We found him. You cannot beat America in a long war, because America remembers her dead and America comes back for them, even 80 years later, even from the bottom of the sea."